Ahoy! The spear is one of the most satisfying weapons to use in New World. It is also one of the most unsatisfying weapons to use in New World. How does that make sense? That's what we're going to talk about today. Let's roll the intro. Now, I want to say this first so it doesn't get misinterpreted later. I absolutely love the spear in New World. I think it has a fantastic mix of everything. It has that self-peel, it has that setup, zoning, melee damage, high burst. You got everything in that weapon when it comes to 1v1 combat. When I first started playing New World, I thought the spear was just meant to be another wide swing weapon like the great axe or hammer before I had tried it, and I was not particularly interested in it. But then I figured, I want to try every weapon once at least, and I tried the spear and I was hooked. I was like, wow, this is actually super high damage, it's a super bursty, this is a pointy stick that I shove in my enemy's face, and it's cool. And I played it for quite a while in PvE, and I found mobs with it, and it quickly became my favorite weapon for that purpose, and it still is. Learned to love the Warhammer for PvE equally, but that's another sad story for another day. So I used the spear for quite a while going through my leveling in the closed beta on my first character that I leveled to level 60, and I kept going back to it in later stages as well. But it wasn't always the most efficient weapon to use, so I switched it out in between, but on level 60 I decided I'll once again try it out and see how it works now. And I liked it for PvE all the way through. The problem started when I tried using the spear as a double melee weapon in PvP. My first few PvP fights were actually completely fine. I ran into some enemies that were just trying to face me head on and just run into me essentially. And the spear did its job very, very well. It did a lot of damage and it had a lot of crowd control, and that's all I needed. So it was easy to take some enemies down. But I quickly had to realize something very unfortunate. And to explain that, we have to discuss what the spear is briefly. So from my perspective, the spear is meant to be a single target weapon primarily. Of course, you can hit multiple targets with your sweep, you can hit multiple targets with your cyclone, but overall, most of the abilities are single target focused, and the basic attacks have a forward strike. This is different from many of the other weapons, which have wide swings, which makes it easier to hit multiple targets. But that's a good thing, right? This weapon is just meant to be better at 1v1. Notice how I said meant to be here. Now, I know I am not the best spear user out there. I'm not going to claim that. I know I have plenty to learn with the spear still, and there are most certainly specific combos or tricks that you can use to make the spear more effective. But we have to look at the overarching picture here. So what happened when I started playing against more experienced players and duelists was that they started sidestepping the attacks. They would run off to the side, they would dodge to the side, and they would use mobility abilities. As you would when you're a more experienced player and you have figured out the base mechanics in New World and you realize that dodging and weaving is very, very important. I'll show some clips in the background here. One is for myself fighting another player, and another one here is from Big Bear from the Mice, who is demonstrating the other side of the issue fighting against the spear player. As we figured out, the hitbox, or rather hurtbox of the spear, is facing forward. So it's relatively narrow and relatively far forward. This means that it is not that easy to confirm it on a moving target, which makes sense. But this is complicated further, because what New World does is add tracking to melee attacks, and this applies for all melee weapons. Tracking means that they follow the target that you're trying to hit. You can see this very well on the great axe, for example, which is almost magnetically sticking to the target even if you're aiming fairly far off. And that is the case for the spear as well. But the problem is that the spear differs in two ways. The spear doesn't have the wide swinging hitbox that would make it easy to hit a target that is moving, and the spear also has less forward momentum of the character itself. The range of the weapon is relatively far, but the character doesn't move very far during the attack. And that in combination leads to attacks being much, much easier to avoid than they are on other weapons. Now, technically, if tracking didn't exist, you could predict the enemy's movement and then hit them where they are going to walk. But that is much, much harder with tracking, because the tracking basically tries to predict where they're going, and resulting from that hits the air where they were half a second ago. Now, there may potentially be ways to solve that I haven't fully tested yet, by for example aiming in front of where they are so the tracking basically snaps back onto them, but that would be an incredibly weird way to aim a weapon, and it would be completely different from any other weapon in New World, and very, very hard to learn and use effectively, to a degree that I think is just weird. But what you can also tell from this is why this particular thing is not really an issue against new players, and in the first days, maybe weeks, you will probably not have any problems using the spear at all. It'll probably be a very strong PvP weapon, simply because you're not gonna run into many enemies that actually try to juke your attacks effectively. You might occasionally run into an alpha or beta player that knows how to, but even all of those don't necessarily know this. But let's assume we're playing against an experienced player, because the problems don't stop there. Due to the lack of forward motion of yourself, the lack of momentum on your own body during the attack, enemies also gain distance to you much quicker when walking away. So you may land that one attack, but that may just be enough for them to get out of range. And the narrow hitbox problems are reflected in other parts of the kit as well. Skewer is one of those abilities that has a relatively narrow forward-facing hitbox. Vault Kick has the same thing, and you kinda have to very strategically position yourself in order to get a stun of Vault Kick. In addition to that, both of these abilities being your technical mobility abilities, they also have massive delays to the extent that in PvP most people don't even use Skewer. It is extremely telegraphed, it's relatively easy to avoid, and because of the slow movement that you get from it, it doesn't create much distance either. Most other melee weapons have a way to get out of a fight as well if you get in trouble, whereas with the spear, you have to inevitably try and CC the enemy in order to create distance in the first place. And that may somewhat work in a 1v1 scenario, but if you ever get chased by a Zerg of players, then good luck to you trying to run away with a spear. You better have a very good secondary mobility weapon in that case. Of course, that's not to say that these abilities are impossible to make work. There are still combos that you can do with other CCs to set them up first, but typically you want to have good hard CCs not require you to use other CCs, and you don't want to have your mobility require you to use other abilities for it to be used halfway effectively. And don't worry, we'll get to some solutions in a bit. But first there's another problem. Sweep is arguably your main and most reliable CC, and it's already pretty telegraphed and relatively easy to dodge, but then again that is the case for quite a few weapons. It's not the case for every weapon to the same degree. For example, the Great Axe once again gets the better CC here with the Reap, but it's still decent. The problem is that because it's considered a stagger, it is countered by Grid, and it's also countered by Berserk. I was talking to Ritzy about this on the podcast the other day, and I actually need to make a small correction on this. I actually found out that while Sweep doesn't work, you can actually knock down a berserking enemy with a Javelin. I found a clip where I actually did that just by random coincidence, so that is possible. So if you have the standard PvP build and you're using Sweep, Javelin, and Vault Kick, then you can technically knock down a berserking enemy with a Javelin, and then follow that up with a Vault Kick to extend the CC and basically take away a lot from their berserk duration. But that is 2 abilities wasted just to temporarily hold them off, and that's not even the end of the berserk still. And you still can't use your sweep against them after that, so you're still probably going to be in trouble depending on what second weapon you have and if they switch their weapon and cancel the berserk or whatever. I think it's great that the spear is a mechanically demanding weapon, but it feels like in many ways it is just held back by being so much more mechanically demanding to even function at an average level that it feels somewhat unrewarding when other weapons make the same things work much easier. For example, I think Javelin is a great example of a skill that is relatively hard to hit, that takes a fair bit of practice until you can reliably land it, and is also very rewarding to hit. So that is a skill that makes me happy. I want to practice it, I want to get better at it, I want to do the coolest Javelin throws. That is how I want the spear kit to be. Now obviously I don't want every weapon skill to be Javelin, though that would be funny as well. But I would like to see other skills paying off in a similar way and also being similarly fair to use and not feeling unfair when, an enemy is using Berserk, for example. There are some more issues with the spear, like for example, it heavily hinging on crit and crit being relatively ineffective at the moment, but I don't want to go into that too deep. What I do think is really interesting about the spear is that it wants you to drain the enemy's stamina first, so they can no longer avoid your attacks, whereas most other melee weapons have ways to force the enemy to use their stamina much easier. And that is something I don't really like, because it, in my opinion, makes it so that the spear is very much pushed into a niche where you're using it with a ranged weapon. Using it as a weapon that you can punish an enemy when they come close to you, because they have to use up their stamina to close that distance to you, and then you can effectively use the skill without worrying about them dodging or your sweep. Other melee weapons don't require you to do that, which allows you to use them with other melee weapons much easier. Now, I said at the start that I absolutely love the spear, and I don't think it would be hard to make the spear work effectively as a PvP weapon as well, because it is a very strong PvE weapon. If it gets fixed, it may actually end up needing some nerfs, because if the abilities actually do what they're intended to do, the spear could do a lot of damage. But I'd rather have a more fluid and effective weapon with slightly less damage than one that depends on how poorly your opponent plays. So here are my suggestions that I think would make the spear a lot more fun to use in PvP. First of all, the most important thing certainly is some tightening on the basic attack animation. Maybe give it a little bit more forward motion, definitely make sure that the tracking works better so that you can actually hit enemies when they're sidestepping. There are a lot of ways in which this could be improved without increasing the DPS in PvE at all, like for example just changing like post and pre-animations. In combination with that, I would suggest speeding up the animation on Skewer. New World did the same thing on the sword launch recently, and it makes it feel so much better, and it's so fun to use now. And I know that Skewer is not looked at as a PvP ability primarily, but if the animation was quick and it was an actual forward leap in a reasonable amount of time, it may very well be a PvP ability. When it comes to Vault Kick, I like that it has some level of skill cap, and it shouldn't be a primary mobility ability, I think. But I think there could be something done about the hitbox at the end. At the moment, the hitbox has basically the same issue as a melee attack, so it's so easy to sidestep it, and I think some more hitbox tolerance there, for example, could change a lot. Or on the other hand, the animation could also be sped up, or the distance or something could be changed slightly. Last but not least, I think Sweep could have some minor improvements. Maybe a little bit of an increase on the range, so it's not quite as easy to dodge out of it, and also potentially a way to not just be a stagger, so you can go through Berserk and also the grit that many heavy attacks have and the 300 strength perk has. The interesting thing about these changes is that most of them would probably not even be felt by newer players or by people just playing against newer players, because it wouldn't really make much of a difference for them, since no damage values are inherently changed, and with the exception of Skewer, there wouldn't really be any massive speed ups or anything. At the same time, for even just medium or higher levels of play, this would make a massive difference for the viability of the spear and make it a much more fun weapon to use at the same time. I would love to see more spear love, and I'd love to put it into my arsenal of very regularly used weapons, and these are the suggestions that I have that would, in my opinion, improve it quite drastically without making it OP at the same time. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, but please keep it somewhat civil. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell to get updated of other New World videos, bunch of guides for all weapons and everything, bunch of other upcoming info, in-depth stuff. There's tons in the work. So stay tuned for that. Links to Twitch and Discord are in the description and in the pinned comment down below if you want to hang out, if you want to have a chat. And other than that, I thank you very much for watching and hope to see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.